was 10 years ago when I started working in a call center as part of the IT department. Most of the employees worked in sales, management, or other customer service roles, but our department was the only one that provided technical support for customers. It felt a little strange being the only woman in my department, but I wanted to prove I could handle the job just as well as anyone else. After my training, I was given two choices for my shift. I could either work from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. 5 days a week, or work the later shift from 2 p.m. to midnight for 4 days a week. I decided on the second option. The idea of working 10 hours a day for 4 days in exchange for 3 days off seemed like a good deal to me. What I didn't consider was that after 6 p.m., I'd be the only person left in the building. That thought made me a little uneasy, but the doors were always locked after everyone else left, so I figured I'd be safe. Most of our customers used our internet services during regular business hours, so by 8 or 9 p.m., the phone calls would slow down a lot. Sometimes I'd only get 2 or 3 calls between 8 p.m. and midnight. To pass the time, I usually brought something to keep me busy when the phone wasn't ringing. Occasionally, I'd go down to the basement to grab a snack or drink from the vending machines. The basement was a bit creepy, mostly because there were windows that faced the back of the building, which was surrounded by nothing but dense forest. Something about that view always made me uneasy, but I'd still head down there whenever I needed something. One night after a long day, I was feeling really tired and was struggling to stay awake at my desk. I decided to go down to the basement to grab a soda from the vending machine, hoping the caffeine would help me power through the last few hours of my shift. As I walked past the basement windows, I thought I saw something move outside, but I brushed it off. It wasn't unusual to see animals like deer out there since the forest was so close to the building. I grabbed my soda from the vending machine when suddenly, I heard a loud bang, like something had hit one of the windows. The sound startled me so much that I froze for a moment, then quickly grabbed my drink and hurried back upstairs. Once I got back to my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was probably just an animal outside, but I couldn't help glancing at the windows around my desk, seeing nothing but darkness. Just when I thought I was getting over it, I heard a noise coming from the front door area. I looked over and saw a tall man standing there, cupping his hands around his face, trying to see inside. My heart skipped a beat as I quickly ducked down behind my desk. But just before I disappeared from view, he spotted me. Our eyes locked for a split second, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I could hear the man trying to open the front door, but thankfully it was locked. Then he started banging on it, harder and harder. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the phone and dialed 911. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, trying to stay as calm as I could, but my voice was trembling. As I was still on the phone, there was a loud crash. It sounded like something had shattered. I crouched down behind my desk, my heart racing. I kept talking to the dispatcher, describing what I was hearing, and they reassured me that the police were on their way. But in a situation like that, every second felt like an eternity. The sound of the man banging on the door continued, and I couldn't help but wonder if he was going to get inside before the police arrived. After what felt like forever, the dispatcher asked me to take a look at the front door. I was terrified to even peek, but I knew I needed to. I slowly stood up and looked over at the door. A large part of the glass at the top had been shattered, but it didn't look like the man could fit through the opening. Still, it was unsettling to see the damage. Then finally, I heard the sweet sound of sirens in the distance. The flashing lights outside were a welcome sight. The police arrived, and I thanked the dispatcher before hanging up the phone. I unlocked the door and spoke to the officers, explaining what had happened. Unfortunately, the man had already run off by the time they got there. The police suspected that he heard the sirens and bolted into the woods to escape. We called the business owner, and it was decided that the building would close for the night. I couldn't shake the feeling of fear, even after the police left. My co-workers speculated about who the man was and what he wanted, but we never found out for sure. All we knew was that he seemed determined to get inside, and that thought alone kept me on edge. After that night, I couldn't work the late shift without constantly looking over my shoulder. The basement trips became even scarier, and every little noise made me jump. I eventually asked to switch to the earlier shift, and luckily, I was able to. Looking back, I'm glad I trusted my instincts and took action when I did. I'll never forget that night, and I'll always be grateful that I was able to call for help before things got worse. Even though it's been years since that incident, the memory still lingers. It was one of the scariest experiences of my life, and I hope I never have to go through something like that again. It was winter of 2017 when I had one of the scariest experiences of my life. At the time, I was working at a gas station in a small town. I used to start my shifts very early in the morning. Just a few days before I started that job, I had crashed my car into the side of the road during an ice storm. Since my car was totaled and I had to wait for the insurance money to get a new one, I didn't have any way to drive to work. Luckily, the gas station was only about 1.5 miles from my apartment. I figured it wouldn't be a big deal to walk to work until I could afford a new car. It wasn't too far, and I told myself it could be a good way to get some exercise. So, that's what I did. Every morning I would wake up early and start walking down the quiet road toward work. Most of the time the road was pretty smooth, and there were usually a few cars driving by, but at 4:30 in the morning, it was pitch dark, and seeing another car was rare. One very cold morning I started my usual walk to work. Everything seemed normal at first. I bundled up in my warmest clothes, put on my gloves, and grabbed my flashlight, since it was far too dark to walk without it. The road passed through a wooded area about halfway between my apartment and the gas station. That part of the walk always made me a bit uneasy because it was so dark, and there were no streetlights to make me feel safe. As I entered the wooded stretch of road, I clicked on my flashlight and started scanning the area around me, just to be sure I wasn't going to trip over anything. The beam of light cut through the darkness, bouncing off trees and bushes as I walked. I wasn't too worried at first. I had passed through this area many times before. It was always quiet, and I had never seen anyone else out there at that hour. But then, I heard something. It was a rustling sound coming from the bushes ahead of me. I stopped in my tracks, feeling my heart race a little. It sounded like something, or someone, was moving in the bushes. I shined my light in the direction of the noise, trying to see what it was. For a moment I held my breath, feeling a wave of fear rush over me. Then a deer jumped out of the bushes, ran across the road, and disappeared into the shrubs on the other side. I let out a nervous laugh. I told myself not to be so scared. This was a small town, and nothing around here could hurt me. I kept walking, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. It didn't help that the woods were so dark and quiet, with no cars or streetlights in sight. A little further down the road, that creepy feeling came back. This time it was stronger. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was just another deer, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I shone my flashlight toward the trees on my left, scanning the area carefully. About 50 feet behind me, I saw something. At first, it looked like someone crouching down, facing a bush with their back to me. My first thought was that it might be a homeless person, but when I stopped and focused the light on them, I realized to my horror that this wasn't a person at all. It was something else, something I had never seen before. Its body was pale, with no hair, and it didn't look like it was wearing any clothes. Its limbs were long and thin, almost unnatural. If it stood up, I guessed it would be taller than 8 feet. Its arms and legs were so long and skinny, and at the ends of its fingers, I could see sharp black points, like claws. I stood frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. As soon as I shined my light directly on it, it turned its head to look at me. Its eyes glowed in the dark, just like an animal's eyes do when light hits them. It reminded me of a cat's or a deer's eyes, but this thing was definitely not an animal. I didn't get a clear look at its face, but from what I could see, it was no human. Panic took over, and without thinking, I turned and ran as fast as I could. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could barely catch my breath. I didn't stop to look back, not even once. I was too terrified to know if it was following me, but I thought I could hear it behind me, chasing me. I kept running down the road, praying that I would make it to safety. In the distance, I saw car headlights coming toward me, and for a moment I felt a small sense of relief. The car passed by, its taillights disappearing behind me, but the fear didn't leave me. I couldn't hear the creature anymore, but I didn't dare slow down. I ran all the way to the gas station, not stopping until I was safely inside. When I finally burst through the door, I was gasping for air, and my hands were shaking. My coworker was already there, getting ready for his shift. He looked at me with concern, asking what had happened. I told him everything, about the strange creature I had seen in the woods, the way it looked, and how it had chased me. To my surprise, he didn't look as shocked as I thought he would. Instead, he seemed worried. Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. He said that another one of our coworkers had seen the exact same thing just a few weeks before. They had described it in the same way: pale skin, long limbs, glowing eyes, and sharp claws. Hearing that someone else had seen it too only made me more terrified. I made up my mind right then and there. I was never going to walk to work in the dark again. From that point on, I called an Uber or got a ride from a friend whenever I had an early shift. I didn't care how much it cost. I wasn't going to risk running into that thing again. To this day, I still don't know what it was that I saw. Part of me wants to believe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but deep down I know it was real. And even though I've moved to a different town and no longer work at that gas station, I'll never forget that cold, dark morning in the winter of 2017. I work at a clothing shop in a big mall, and recently I got promoted to assistant manager. After a few weeks of training, I had to close the store by myself for the first time. We didn't have many employees, so it was just me and one other worker that evening. I was a little nervous, but I figured it would be fine since nothing much ever happened at the store during the late hours. As I was working near the front of the store, organizing some clothes, I noticed a man sitting on a bench just outside. He was talking on his phone, but it didn't seem like a big deal. I smiled at him as I kept doing my job, thinking nothing of it. There were always people sitting outside the store, waiting for friends or just relaxing, so I didn't pay him much attention. A little later, I asked my coworker to help me put up a new signboard. It was a big one that we had to hang from the ceiling, so it took us a bit of time to get it just right. After that, I went back to the front of the store to check if everything was in order. When I looked outside, I noticed that the same man was still sitting on the bench. This time, though, he wasn't on the phone. He glanced at me and then started whispering to himself, but I could still hear bits of what he was saying. I might be able to take two. "Here comes one now," I heard him mutter under his breath. That made me feel uneasy. I started thinking that maybe he was planning to steal something. We'd had some issues lately with people grabbing items from the front tables and running off with them. So, I moved closer to the front of the store and started folding clothes, keeping an eye on him. I figured if I stayed nearby, he might think twice about doing anything suspicious. A few minutes later, the man looked right at me and said, "Excuse me, ma'am. Can you come here for a moment?" I politely told him that I couldn't, because I was the manager on duty and needed to stay in the store. I didn't want to leave the store unattended, especially with only one other person working that evening. But he kept asking, saying things like he just needed a quick favor. Each time I said no. Then he changed his tone a bit and said, "I just want to show you how nice that banner looks, the one you put up." That's when things started to feel really weird. Something in the way he was acting made me uncomfortable, so I took a few steps back into the store, putting some distance between us. I didn't want to go outside, and now I wasn't sure if he was planning something or just being creepy. To my surprise, the man got up from the bench and walked into the store after me. He started looking around, talking the whole time, though his words didn't really make much sense. I was just about to tell my coworker to call security when, thankfully, my boss came in. She was there to put up the schedule for next week. My boss is older, bigger, and more intimidating than I am. When the man saw her walk in and realized she worked there too, he quickly left the store. He didn't say a word, just turned around and walked out in a hurry. I felt a huge sense of relief. I immediately went to my boss and told her what had happened. She looked really concerned. We had been hearing about strange incidents in the mall lately, but nothing like this had happened to me before. Just as we were talking, a security guard walked by, so I stopped him and explained the situation. The guard listened carefully and told me they had heard about similar things happening in the mall recently, with a few people complaining about strange men trying to lure them outside or following them around. As we were talking, I glanced toward the mall entrance and saw the same man again, walking further down the corridor. "There he is," I said, pointing him out to the guard. The security guard nodded and walked over to talk to the man. I watched from inside the store, nervous about what might happen next. After a few minutes, the guard came back and told us that he had warned the man not to bother anyone else, but since the man hadn't done anything illegal, they couldn't call the police. There just wasn't enough reason. Even though the situation didn't escalate, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling I had. The whole thing felt too close for comfort. Luckily, I haven't seen the man since that day. The security team has been keeping an eye out for any suspicious people, and I've been more careful when I work closing shifts. I make sure to always have someone with me, and I keep my phone handy in case anything strange happens again. Working at the clothing store is usually a fun and easy job, but that night reminded me that things can change in an instant. You always have to be aware of your surroundings and trust your instincts. Looking back, I'm just glad I didn't leave the store when that man first asked me to come outside. Who knows what could have happened if I had?